welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. I think we still have a few folks filtering in, but we have a great program today, episode 76 of This Is CDR, and we're going to go ahead and get to it. My name's Toby Bryce. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, and I work with the Open Air Collective on carbon removal policy and market development. So just a quick background on This Is CDR. It's an online event series that we launched in August of 2021 to explore the range of carbon removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals Open Air is working to advance really at every level of government here in the US, with a focus on state and local policy, as well as in national and subnational jurisdictions globally. Quick background on Open Air, if you're not familiar with us, we're a distributed volunteer network dedicated to advancing carbon removal. We work together on open source projects that we call missions in the areas of policy, innovation, communications, and activist market development. Our co-founder, Chris Neidl, is running the chat, and he will be putting some links in there, some background links about Open Air, and also a link to a form where you can sign up to join what we're doing. Here's a graphical representation of the kinds of missions we work on. I would say there are a few dozen active missions, again, in these 4 different areas. Lots of stuff to work on, and we'd love to have you be a part of what we're doing. The good news today is that we have a world-leading expert on the definition of carbon removal with us, so we're going to skip our preamble, and we're going to go ahead and get right to the program. If Mega can come on and do the quick introduction, I will go from there.
Hey guys, I am Mega. I'm an Open Air member based in London, and I also work on policy and market development. So we're going to start with a short presentation from Holly, followed by a few prepared questions, and then moderated audience Q&A. Type any questions you have into the Q&A box. Please do find the one labeled Q&A, because that'll just help us separate it out from all of the stuff going on in the chat. And we will record this event and send it out to everyone who registered, as well as post it on Open Air's YouTube channel and website. This week, we're very pleased to welcome back Dr. Holly Jean Buck to discuss her recent paper with some colleagues that she's written called Why Residual Emissions Matter Right Now, and the implications of that work on the climate role of CDR. Dr. Holly Jean Buck is a geographer and environmental social scientist studying rural futures, the politics of platforms, and how emerging technologies can address environmental challenges. She works as an assistant professor of environment and sustainability at the University of Buffalo in Buffalo, New York, and has a Ph.D. in development sociology from Cornell University. She is the author of After Geoengineering, Climate Tragedy, Repair and Restoration, and Ending Fossil Fuels, Why Net Zero is Not Enough. So Dr. Holly Jean Buck, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. I'm excited to talk about a paper that I wrote with Niels Markussen, Wim Carton, and Jens Frieslund about residual emissions. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So quick recap of what we all know. We're striving for net zero around mid-century and net zero greenhouse gases later this century. So you can see a figure from the IPCC about that and kind of note the difference in the timing between these 2 different targets. We'll return to that in a minute. But basically, we're all striving for this. Very exciting that we've managed to get this much momentum and consensus about a goal. We were interested in, with that net zero, what are countries planning for? Are they planning for net zero that has a lot of remaining emissions and a lot of removals? Are they planning for a net zero with a small kind of near zero emissions and a smaller carbon removal infrastructure? Like, it wasn't clear. So how do you figure that out? Well, first we looked at the nationally determined contributions that countries submit under the Paris Agreement, but those typically just go to, a shorter time frame, say 2030. So we turned to the long-term strategies that countries have put together, and they've been doing this for the past few years. This was an invitation in the Paris Agreement, so parties should strive to formulate and communicate their long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, thinking about, their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. They have different national circumstances. Still, this is kind of the invitation. How are you thinking about this longer term? So around 51 countries, we looked at those, and we focused on, we read all of them. We kind of coded them for what was in there. We focused a lot in this paper on the Annex 1 countries, so the more developed countries, because it's more fair, we thought, to compare them. So just about half of countries discuss residual emissions in some way. The others don't really even address this. And only 14 of them break them down by sector. So already we're working with not very much information to try to answer this question. So always remember kind of the limitations of your data source, right? But we used this data source because it was really kind of the only thing we had to answer this question. And the other important thing to know about these long-term strategies is that they are not plans. They are documents that have a variety of projections, typically under different scenarios. So you'll see kind of a business as usual scenario, you'll have a with existing policies scenario, and sometimes other scenarios that are like with additional measures or with more ambitious action. There can be a number of projections in these documents. And so we were looking in our analysis at kind of what the most ambitious ones, we didn't even address the least ambitious ones. So what is in here? A lot of net zero targets, some other framings, generally 2050, if it's specified. About half of these considered technological carbon removal. Considered is maybe a generous word. A lot of them did not address this in much detail. And then in terms of how residual emissions, or these leftover emissions at the point of net zero, are defined, there's no consensus standard definition. So countries looked at these in different ways. Some of them talked about not being possible to reach zero. Some of them said, it's unlikely that these are eliminated. Others talked about emissions that are avoidable according to the current state of knowledge. Some of them looked at kind of the politics of this or the economics of it, what's very expensive to abate versus technologically possible, or, there's all these dimensions, no consistent thing. And then we looked at how much, compared to current emissions in this instance, 2019, for the Annex 1 countries, and kind of on average, 18% of emissions were remaining compared to 2019 levels, which might be more than we would expect, although I'm not sure it's consistent with some of the integrated assessment modeling, which isn't surprising because the modeling used to generate these strategies is similar to integrated assessment modeling. Lots of times it'll be like a national level energy model that's used. But still, if in our mental mind, we're thinking, okay, we're going to decarbonize 90% of where we are now and then compensate the last 10% with CDR, most countries are thinking about more than 10% is the takeaway here. So where are these emissions coming from? I'll note that only the UK looked at international aviation and shipping. Most countries just kind of push that to the side. Mainly it's agriculture, and then some residual emissions from industry. And in some cases, other forms of transport. But in general, the energy sector is quite low and can be decarbonized in most of these ambitious analyses. It's mainly industry and agriculture that's left over. And then we looked at the question of, are countries expecting their land sink to deal with these residual emissions? And in general, they're expecting that they can either retain or enhance the removal capacity of the land system. However, in many cases, that is not enough to compensate. So they would need technological carbon removal if they had these levels of residual emissions. And I'll include a slide or two on the US long-term climate strategy. I know that there's probably listeners from all around the world, but this is one of the ones that, typically it doesn't specify too much in a very clear fashion about carbon removal, but it does expect carbon removal to take care of this last bit. You can see the different, looking at reductions from transportation, buildings, industry. The US strategy is a little bit unique in that it looks at non-CO2 emissions by itself. And so still the numbers that are kind of embedded in this are still pretty massive. They're expecting that the land sink continues with its like 800 million tons, and then there's an additional few 100 million tons, possibly more, of technological carbon removal. You can see that illustrated a little bit in this graph that they have about energy emissions in particular. And we could look at a number of these strategies. I'm not going to today, but it's interesting the level of the lack of a plan, to be honest. You would hope that by this point in time, there would be more defined planning from the governments of the world. But these kind of graphs with their confusing axes and lack of specific numbers is kind of what we've got right now. So here are the main takeaways from this paper. Residual emissions don't have a standard conceptual definition. Projected residual emissions are a substantial percentage, in my view, of current emissions, averaging around 18% for these Annex 1 countries in the most ambitious scenarios. That's not even looking at the existing policy scenarios. Mainly agriculture and industry, but few countries are really even getting to that sectorally specific level. And the land sinks can't balance out remaining emissions. So what? So these are further arguments from our team. We think that you have to think about carbon removal capacity as limited. So why would it be limited? Limited by, what looms the largest in my head as a sociologist is social license for the amount and types of infrastructure we need. But thinking about limitations in land availability, limitations in renewable energy capacity when we need renewable energy for a lot of other things, limitations of not necessarily the geologic storage capacity, although that may not be well matched to the geographies of CDR, but limitations in the rate in which it can be injected into the ground. And so, a variety of different types of limitations that I think we need to think about. So assuming it will be limited, and then you have these trade-offs. So if you're using that carbon removal capacity to compensate for these ongoing emissions from industry, say, then you're not using that capacity for thinking about legacy emissions and dealing with an overshoot. And so we think we need to specify residual emissions to a greater degree so that we don't waste our valuable carbon removal capacity on activities that we could have abated, but we just didn't want to for whatever political reason. And we think that this is a problem for right now. I know that you may think that, okay, well, all of these solutions are so nascent. Let's just focus on the innovation and building these demo projects and getting some of it going, and deal with these complicated policy problems later down the road once this industry is scaling a bit more. But we do think it's important to think about it now because we're creating the architecture for how it all works. And so whose problem is this? This is the challenge. It's like public engagement. There's not one actor that's tasked with it, but it's really important to making the whole thing work. So you could think, okay, maybe sellers are supposed to deal with this. Maybe they should only be selling to certain sectors. That's probably not the most realistic answer. It could be an answer. You could think maybe the buyers are responsible, and that in addition to certifying, what's being sold, we could actually be thinking about certifying the buyers that what they're compensating for is actually hard to abate. Maybe it's the role of the exchangers who are dealing with platforms or the markets, that they're guaranteeing that the exchanges that happen on their platform are for hard to abate emissions. maybe this is a problem for government, and all of this needs to transcend voluntary markets and work its way into a more regulatory scheme. So I think that this problem is distinct from MRV. I know that many of us on this call think a lot about MRV and that challenge. But I think we can think about these problems in parallel with each other, because some of the stuff we're thinking about in terms of compliance market design or designing of procurement intersects both of these challenges. And so in the paper, we write about 3 policy challenges on kind of a high level, a global look. We think a little bit about creating safeguards against rush dynamics. In part, that's because a lot of the people in this paper have been working in fields like political ecology, where they've been doing more grounded anthropological study on what happens in particular places in the world when these rush dynamics come in for forest carbon, say, or for land deals. And that's influenced the thinking there. And I know that, again, maybe this seems like a very far off concern when, we're still in this kind of 1,000-ton range, but looking down the road, there's kind of a warning about how do we make sure that the incentives and the policies we set up don't end up creating these rush dynamics, rushes for land or for pore space or for renewable resources to power CDR, for ocean space. Safeguards for that would be a smart thing to be working on right now. Then second, like we've already touched on, making sure that removals are actually compensating for truly hard to abate activities. And then thinking about some of the global justice dimensions. So there's a moral imperative for rich countries like the US to actually deliver net negative emissions earlier, ideally earlier than 2050, although I don't think that seems very feasible. But thinking about, the justice dimensions, if we have this global net zero at 2050, right? So richer countries should be there sooner to allow a bit more space for other countries. And then there's also this dimension that if the wealthy countries are using up the CDR capacity, then that's even further pressure constraints for other countries. So how do we think about that in global policy? Big questions. We make a couple of pretty basic recommendations for the researchers or the NGOs or the policymakers thinking about this. Pretty obvious. The first thing is, how can we get more clear about the amount of residual emissions that we expect, where they're coming from, what sectors, what geographies, and particularly what types of greenhouse gases? Because in general, this is missing from most of the strategies, and this seems like something that we could feasibly be more specific about. Then we also think that the policy and research communities should, work out defined criteria for what's actually hard to abate. We actually think this is a pretty doable thing too, and definitely there's actors that are already working on it. But in general, we need to be more specific about whether we expect these residual emissions to be an ongoing state, through the later part of the century, which I understand is hard to do because we don't know what technologies will mature and when. So we need a process for revisiting these assumptions regularly too. But I think that that it would be a cop-out just to say that, it's too uncertain. I do think that we need to be doing some planning for these timeframes because we're thinking about investing in infrastructure that has a lifespan of decades, whether that's fossil fuel infrastructure or other types of infrastructure. So there is a rationale to becoming more explicit about our assumptions here. So are those residual emissions an ongoing thing, or are they a temporary thing that we're expecting to taper out towards a further state of decarbonization? And that this is important for some of the temporal planning around different CDR techniques because they all have different temporalities to them, both in terms of how long they take to scale up and when the climate really notices that they're mature. So I'll leave off there. It's been 20 minutes, and I look forward to a discussion about all of this.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you, Holly. it's a very thorny topic, and it's kind of hard to formulate questions about it. But I'm going to start with I believe you co-authored the chapter in the CDR primer about how much carbon removal we need, that had the bottoms up 1.5 to 3.1 gigatons range.
I did not, but I did interview some of the authors for my book.
Okay.
And so I'm just going to share that
Yeah.
figure for everybody. So
Okay.
what we're talking about, because I was really interested when I saw this, and Andrew Bergman and Tolly Rinberg and some others worked on this. And what it's saying is they did a bottom-up analysis of, okay, what from a technological standpoint could we abate? And as you can see here, it's a much smaller figure than these, 10 to 15 gigatons you might see from some of the integrated assessment modeling.
Right.
It's the 1.5 to 3.1, like you were saying, Toby.
And do you feel like it? Would you that was done in whatever, a couple years ago at this point, probably 3 years ago at this point. Do you think that is still a good range to be looking at? Would you like, if that analysis were to be updated, do you think it would be a little bit different now? Obviously, I guess it could be different depending on who's doing the analysis, but.
Yeah, well, I think this would be a really great time to update this with a broader constellation, and maybe a broader constellation of authors, but a broader process for doing it. It may be the same, it may be different. I really have no idea. I think that we're having some good conversations about fertilizer decarbonization around green ammonia or like microbes. It's not my area of expertise, but that seems interesting. We're having conversations about sustainable aviation fuels and electrofuels and what's feasible there. And so, I think that you might see something around this range, though, if you repeated it, but it would be worth doing.
So if you did a rigorous assessment of what's truly hard to abate, you get to a much lower number than that 10 to 15 IPCC number people throw around.
Yeah, and what we should be doing is doing this every 5 years, like we do some of these other assessments, and seeing what the latest is over time.
Yep. And we didn't do this in the beginning because we skipped our preamble, but I put a link to the CDR primer website. And here's the physical book, which everyone should have on their desk if you're working in carbon removal, which you can order from that website. So it's a great resource. So like, and you talked, just to recap, like if you, not to use a climate podcast cliche, but if you could wave your magic wand, can you recap how residual emissions would ideally be defined? Like, what would that process look like? Who would be involved? And you just said maybe we should update it every 5 years.
That's a great question. And so obviously, I don't think any one actor can make the definition, but I think we need a process that involves expertise from each of these sectors. And I'm sure it will be contested because as soon as you have somebody with deep industry experience, then there's conflicts of interests, right? But I would say that we need a process with as many actors as possible that's still manageable. And the main thing is that it's a very transparent process with this kind of rigorous review where different people can contest the assumptions. It's always going to be a political determination. It'll never be a purely technical one. But we do this with climate science broadly. So, it'll be similar probably to some of the IPCC type things.
I was going to say, is an IPCC like venue, or the IPCC the right place for this to happen? And why does it not happen? Because why do they use these IAMs, as we like to call them, and don't do the bottoms up work?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the thing about being an IPCC author is you're just bound by what's already in the literature. So if there isn't a research group coming up with this, and it is a really big project to do a bottom-up analysis. It would cost a few million, I guess, to do it well. And so we just need a funder to get on that.
Wait, Point taken. I'm going to put a link in the chat. So what are your thoughts? So speaking of integrated assessment models, there's this, this slide, it's on page 13 of this Goldman Sachs Carbonomics, quote unquote, report. It's in, almost not every, but like I would say 50% of carbon removal companies' pitch decks. What are your thoughts on using carbon removal to abate non-residual emissions that we could abate, but if carbon removal is cheaper? So like if carbon removal is cheaper than abating a certain kind of emission, is that okay? Or do you think that we need to be more rigorous than that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be more rigorous because I'm assuming that there will be limits to carbon removal capacity. And obviously we don't have a study that really defines what those limits are. And I don't think we'll have a good one in the near term, because to do it well, you would really have to integrate some of the social considerations, which are going to be the limits. And we don't have teams of interdisciplinary people that work well enough together to do that in a rigorous way. So my assumption is there will be limits on the CDR capacity. Therefore, it's really important that it goes to things that we really don't know how to abate. And also, I also think that the economics of this are changeable based on policy. So then the question is, well, what policies can we be doing to like help electrofuels or sustainable aviation fuel so we're not using CDR to compensate? But I do think you need a case-by-case look at all of these things. So that's like my blanket intuitive answer, but I'm sure there's exceptions.
So sort of related, the science-based targets, it currently has an open call for feedback. It's like a 68 question survey monkey thing on beyond value chain mitigation. And we can put a link to that in the chat, maybe, Chris, if you can find that. But so basically, I'm going to grossly simplify, but the science-based targets says that you need, strong prioritization on emissions reduction, 90+%, which I think we all think is kind of correct. And then I think there's this sort of debate about whether we can be making compensation claims and really offsetting emissions right now, given for a variety of factors. And then the beyond value chain mitigation is saying that corporations and other organizations should set a budget and try to maximize climate impact with contribution claims, as opposed to trying to compensate at this current stage for their continuing emissions. I didn't explain that very well, but you can probably explain it better. And do you have thoughts on that approach? I know there have been some criticisms of science-based targets. I mean, it seems like, it seems like directionally correct, but obviously, as you point out, there are a lot of different actors behind the scenes there. What are your general thoughts on these ideas and this concept of contribution versus compensation claims in 2023, where we are now?
Yeah, well, I'm fairly sure I couldn't explain that better. I think that it makes sense to me that an actor would not make compensation claims. Like, it might be early for that, but then you would get into the question, okay, when would be the appropriate moment to switch over to that regime? I think that my general view about corporate climate action is that the net zero framing is restrictive, but as soon as you step away from it, you face this other problem. So I think that it's a problem that everybody's focused very narrowly on net zero, because there's a lot of other things that we care about that we could be tracking, like clean energy deployment, like adaptation contributions, adaptation finance, like the phase out of fossil fuel infrastructure. And right now we're locked into this narrow net zero framing. And, that's guiding. And so we're missing some of the other things we need to do. On the other hand, if our approach was like, okay, we're stepping away from net zero, we're stepping away from a compensation view, we're just, making contributions, there's a way in that you could easily see how that becomes like an escape or a workaround from from some of the rigor and the math involved. So I don't have like the answer. I'm really interested what will come from this process that you mentioned that they're doing, this consultation, because they did a survey. I was just reading through the report that came out in June. And one of the interesting things from that was that companies are feeling nervous about some of the contribution or the beyond the value chain mitigation, because they don't want to be accused of greenwashing. So I empathize with like the company trying to figure out how to navigate what's best to do here and the optics of it.
I mean, it seems difficult to win. What if you were to advise a company or an organization, like what do you think is, in your opinion, the current best practice? I mean, you could look at someone like Swiss Re, and they're not a heavy emitter. So it's kind of, I'm not going to say it's easier for them, but they don't have the same problems that a large mining company would have, or a cement manufacturer, but they have an aggressive decarbonization target, net zero target, I believe, of 2030. And they actually have interim targets that they need to hit. They have an internal price on carbon, and that creates a budget for contribution and or compensation. And they're, I think, ratcheting the percentage of their offsets or contributions from 10% in 2021 to 100% in 2023 to basically say that all of their residual emissions in 2023 will be neutralized by high quality. It's so hard to use the right words here, but neutralized by high quality carbon removal. Is that a good approach? Are there better approaches? Like what is a corporation to do? Because there are definitely bad actors out there, but there are corporations that do want to try to figure out how to do the right thing, I think.
Yeah. Well, in general, I think investing in high quality carbon removals is good. I think that there's two things that are valuable here that we're not measuring well, and that it may be impossible to measure. One is the value of just the innovation. So right now, if I was a company, I'd be thinking about not what can I do to compensate for my emissions, but where can I place my investments so I'm catalyzing innovation. That's really kind of the function of CDR investing right now. I think Jane Flagle and others have said this better than I could. But so I'd be thinking about the value of the innovative investment, which we can't put a number or a weight on, but is really important. And I'd be thinking about the social benefits, sometimes co-benefits, but I've also heard people use the phrase core benefits because, they really are core. They're what's important to some adopters. Like if you think about soil carbon, a lot of the adopters, the farmers are thinking about, the water retention benefits or whatever. That's really motivating. And I would also place a weight on that social value or even sometimes ecosystem value, but again, we don't have like the number for it. So we're stuck back in this net zero compensatory thing because that's where the numbers are. So I would be developing a framework or a way of thinking along with my peers that would recognize both the social value and the value of innovation and being catalytic.
And so when does this does seem like a good idea in many ways. It does seem like also an idea that a bad actor could easily exploit for greenwashing. So like, how do you create any sort of compliance framework around this idea or regulatory framework? So it's hard to understand in the absence of a compliance market how this would work universally in terms of our current voluntary situation, but maybe it's better than what we have. But if you are in this framework, when is the right point to transition from a contribution claim to a compensatory claim, if I'm using the right lingo? Like, when does that happen? At net zero, 5 years before net zero? Like when the world decides that carbon removal is ready in 2035? Like, is there a point? Like, when does that happen, I guess?
You could think about answering that question in different ways. You could pick some kind of physical threshold. Once like a certain amount of emissions have been mitigated, then your focus is on this. You could think about it, although also in terms of a social threshold. I'm not sure the best way to answer it. I think that the kind of answers to these questions comes from groups of people thinking together. So, if I was in charge of
Yeah.
things, I would convene a forum with all the smartest people I knew and put them in a room for a week and see if they could make some progress.
Okay, I think we should make that happen. Two more quick, well, they're not going to be super quick necessarily, but two more questions from me, and then we have a bunch of great audience questions. Please keep those coming in, and Mega will come on in just a couple minutes to start asking Holly some of those. Number one, and this is completely orthogonal to what we've been talking about, but I've tried to get my mind around in relation to this issue. There's this idea of like for like offsetting, or I guess they are compensatory claims. The idea being that emissions from land use and agriculture can be offset by shorter term carbon removals, forest carbon and soil carbon, and fossil carbon emissions have to be neutralized by long duration carbon removal, geospheric, as I think Zeke Hausfather has coined carbon removal. That seems to relate to some of the residual emissions accounting work in your paper. Is there a way that you could link that to policy and outcomes? Because it seems like a good idea, but it also, I think, requires a lot of groundwork for it to be implemented for baseline.
So I can see how, I mean, I would approach it, the idea from the question of, well, is this more likely politically to get the job done? And I do think maybe there's ways in which you could enroll the ag sector in ag removal by having them focus on their own emissions. I think that some of the rationale for this is, also trying to spin up geological removals and get the fossil fuel industry. People think the fossil fuel industry is super interested in this, but if you think about their capacity and what they've actually done, they don't seem very, very interested at all compared to what they could be doing. So I do think there's an argument there too. And I'm curious what others think about this, but I guess it's not like an open discussion forum.
Yeah.
But yeah, we should have a deep dive into that one day.
On that. Okay. So one last question, just back to, the definition of carbon removal, the one that we use is that, between now and net zero, which we've already talked about as being a challenging concept in many ways, the purpose of carbon removal is to neutralize truly hard to abate residual emissions. And then we get to this notional net zero point, and we're going to need to continue to do that because presumably technology can get better, and we continue to 2050 or whatever your net zero year is kind of an arbitrary point in time, and we will have technology advancement to hopefully diminish residual emissions after that point. But then there's the idea of removing, at that point will be probably 2 trillion plus tons of legacy greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere. Is that the right definition of carbon removal? Or obviously, if you were required to define it week in and week out, how would you define it? Like that, or something different, or something additional?
I mean, I think it's broadly correct. The challenge, I think, is, the tech will get better. We'll have more ways to get to true zero probably near the end of the century, but only if we consciously decide to phase out fossil fuels. Like the tech getting better won't get us there by itself. So that would be like the qualifier I would add to that narrative, which then, you're far beyond the scope of a definition of carbon removal, but it's really important. The geopolitical challenges to phasing out fossil fuels, all of the challenges are immense, and just having cheaper renewables won't get us there.
Okay, so that gets back to the point that maybe it's not okay to just use carbon removal to neutralize emissions because it's cheaper. So we need to have these other overarching governance or goals in addition to just net zero.
Yeah, we need a lot of other goals. We need net zero, but we also need adaptation goals we seriously fund. We also need phase out goals. And you could imagine a whole bunch of dashboards that track all of this, right? There's other things we could be putting our attention on as well.
Yeah. Great. Well, I don't think I've solved anything here, but it's been a great discussion. I always enjoy talking to you. So thank you so much. And Mega, do you want to come on and ask some audience questions? Cool.
Sure. Yeah, we've got quite a few. I think the first one I wanted to ask is kind of from a philosophical perspective. If you look at like global net zero, that's just like a scientific target, right? We have emissions and we net them out, we get to zero. But then thinking about that at like an individual level or a corporate level or a national level, that becomes more of a question of allocating the responsibility. And so if we say like each country, each company needs to hit net zero, that's kind of saying it's basically a polluter pay model and that's the right allocation. Do you agree with that, or do you think it could have more to do with some of the concepts you brought up about ability to do it or ability to abate? Like, basically, how do you think is the right way to actually allocate this overall responsibility towards net zero?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of research and writing on kind of different ways according of different conceptions of justice. We could maybe post some of those links, but I think that what we can say for sure is allowing the market to determine this isn't the appropriate way. That's pretty easy to state. And then thinking about what is the appropriate way, that's a lot harder.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. And then in terms of how it actually ends up getting allocated, have you started to see any countries really setting credible pathways to net zeros? Do you think the UNFCCC will get involved, or how do we actually get to this point where we like define national contributions towards net zero and what's left over after that?
Yeah, I think the real question is how many countries, which countries will decide to go net negative. I think this will be an important point of debate coming up. And you've seen some countries discuss it. You've also seen countries discuss residual emissions more concretely as they make up carbon management strategies. That seems to be a catalytic point. So for example, Germany is making up a residual emissions strategy kind of at the same point in time as they're thinking about carbon management. France also has a new carbon management strategy, and they're thinking about like the 50 top emitters and what's the plan for each of those. So we are seeing some countries take a more specific approach to determining residual emissions, even from particular facilities.
Okay. And do you think the UNFCCC or like that whole process will get involved at all, or is it more just going to be left to the countries to decide what that looks like?
I mean, it'll be left to countries, I suspect, but the idea of this whole long-term strategies is that countries could see what each other are doing and have to kind of put on paper their long-term thinking, and that would help guide the shorter-term nationally determined contributions. And so hopefully that process will work.
Okay, got it. And then just, I know you talked about this a bit, but in terms of the difference between like hard to abate versus residual versus things that we should just definitely abate, like how much do you think that becomes a scientific question where you can sort of say, scientifically, there's a reason why this is harder than that? Or is it more about like a social or sort of political question where it's just what kind of negotiation do we all come to in deciding what we define as hard or residual?
Yeah, so I think there's a scientific element to what will always be a social or political process. And what I'd like to see is the scientific element be brought up more and be put in terms more explicitly, so then people can debate around it.
Okay. And what about like the social justice dimension? And I don't know if that's part of the same concept, but is that like, saying certain emissions that are inequitable to abate or would put too much of a burden on certain people, is that part of the same framework in your thinking?
So I think there's always trade-offs that are going to have justice implications that we're not looking at. And in some cases, those may be justice implications of, keeping a particular facility running and compensating for it with CDR. If that facilities also has, criteria air pollutants, then there's justice implications there. But conversely, if, compensating with CDR is going to make everything cheaper, there may be justice implications to that as well, in terms of who's bearing the cost of, doing mitigation in one particular fashion. I hope that made sense. But what I'm saying right now is we're not having a good debate about all of these trade-offs because they're not adequately unpacked.
Okay, got it. Okay, and then, I mean, this is, well, I guess this is kind of related, but if you think about just this idea that you had of rush dynamics, can you talk about, what that actually looks like and what's the right pace that we can make progress, and how do you sort of set things up in the right way on that, in that regard?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things we learned from the land rush that took place in the wake of the global food price spikes around 2010, going on maybe to probably tapering off by 2012. So there was a big, large scale land acquisitions, and biofuels played a role. A lot of factors played a role in that. But one of the things that we could see is that some of it was just speculative activity that didn't even really have that much of a chance of manifesting. So there's a danger, even just from the speculation on this land, or even just from the idea of large-scale CDR, even if these actors don't have the capability to actually do it, like plant, all of these biofuels or whatever, just the idea can catalyze a rush. And there's some good writing that, lessons learned from that, things that we could do differently, but we have to, and what those safeguards look like, they could look like more hard law in terms of different national laws, but they could also be more kind of governance norms in terms of companies signing on to particular codes of conduct around that. There's a whole range of things that we could be doing.
Got it. Okay. And then just thinking about like how this is all going to move forward. So I think we're kind of in a world where a lot of the CDR credits being bought are actually being bought by companies that don't have the most emissions. Like you touched on this, but it's the big tech companies who might not have that many emissions, or like not that much hard to abate emissions, versus like mining or aviation companies. At what point do you sort of see that transition starting to take place? And like, how does that happen? Because it feels like right now, a lot of the tech companies are doing it because they support the industry and they think it's important. But eventually it needs to be directed to like, where can buyers who need that for their residual emissions start to do that? So how do you kind of envision that going forward?
Yeah, I don't really see that happening without national level policies in some of the large emitters. So
Yeah.
smaller countries like Sweden could maybe pioneer different policy designs and act like policy labs, but really you need the US, you need China, you need some other nations to have compliance markets, or some equivalent policy that that forces CDR purchases.
Yeah. And are you kind of expecting there to be like a tipping point where there's a wave of these, or is it just going to continue to sort of slowly roll on with, little incremental changes in certain countries? Because it feels like with some things, and I think Open Air is a big proponent of this, there could be, a viral element to these policies where it starts in a few places and then it spreads and more people adopt it. Do you think something like that is likely, or is it going to be kind of a long, slow march towards those policies being global?
I think that this whole industry is quietly betting that we have, big climate policy, right? That's the assumption. Like you have something like 45Q that lasts for a certain number of years. And, I've talked to people from polluting companies that are like, well, this is still uncertain. We still don't think it's going to happen, because what happens after 10 years or X years? So there still seems to be some ambiguity about whether there's going to be real climate action or not. And so I don't have a crystal ball. I'm very concerned because I think a lot of the theory of change implicitly is that you have these big social movements that, go out in the streets and demand change, and then change happens. And then actually what we see is backlash to renewables and kind of the weakening maybe of that coalition. of activists. So I'm not saying that we're going to necessarily get this big climate policy and these compliance markets and all of that, but that's, you know, what this industry needs if it's going to manifest. So we'll see.
Yeah, fair enough. We got a few questions about the timing. So the first one is pretty straightforward, but do you still think that, you know, net zero 2050, which I think is something that gets thrown out a lot, is that still like a meaningful and helpful goal that we should all be keeping in mind, or is that kind of maybe a red herring?
In some ways it's wishful thinking, but also it's the best goal, because if we want to curb warming to safer limits, we need to do it. So like, we just gotta keep it as a goal, I think.
Okay, yeah. I mean, on the sort of much more optimistic side, someone also asked, like, you know, let's say we decide we're able to accelerate those targets, and, you know, maybe we want to hit net zero sooner, or we find ways to do abatement so that we don't need as much CDR, whatever it is. If we were to accelerate some of our goals, does that change any of the recommendations that you're talking about? Or does it kind of apply as we flex some of the parameters around?
Good question. I mean, I think if we accelerate the goals, we need even more targeted planning. I mean, I'm really thinking just about the planning that goes into decommissioning all of our gas pipelines and our petrol stations, and all of these things need really a lot of targeted planning, both on the physical infrastructure and on the social side of helping a workforce transition.
Yeah, okay, got it. Someone asked, I guess this is kind of related to what I was asking earlier about, you know, who's responsible and who pays, but is there a potential to sort of get the tech companies who have high revenue relative to their emissions to take on responsibility for, say, the companies that they generate revenue from, so to sort of take more responsibility on to get them to pay more because they're the ones that currently have the capacity to do it? Or do you feel like ultimately it's going to have to fall to whoever is directly emitting, just in terms of like the way that we actually end up allocating these things? Like, is there a way to sort of do something like that to maybe accelerate ability to pay for this kind of thing?
That's a really interesting idea. And if you walk through a hypothetical, like say you're Amazon and you have a contract with like Chevron for cloud services or something.
Right. Exactly.
I don't think that would be a great use, because Chevron also has a ton of money, but maybe there's some other type of emitter that's doing something that's more socially useful that doesn't have money. You know, what if they're a small family farmer that can't afford to upgrade their equipment to the latest precision ag? I could see like a case for supporting them.
Yeah, there was a paper, I can't remember, maybe someone can put it in the chat, but it was like, I think Carbon Gap and Robert Hoagland that kind of compared the ability to pay of like different industries versus their emissions. And it wasn't like shocking. I think it was, you know, the tech giants who have loads of money and are not the biggest emitters relative to their profit, who are the ones we all know about paying for CDR, but interesting to see what other industries kind of fall on the opposite side of the scale. Cool. Maybe just one last one before I let you go. What do you think is going to be the trigger to kind of develop these compliance markets and policies that you've been talking about? Like, is there something that's going to be the tipping off point, or do we just kind of have to keep slowly, you know, plodding along and hoping for the best?
I mean, we need a revitalized climate movement that can work with enough groups of people to have like a coalition of voters that's dominant in both houses and the executive branch. So, you know, we really need to change some of the discourse and tactics of the climate movement to build that bigger coalition that's appeals to a broad swath of voters. Like, I don't know how else you do it. So that was a very US-centric answer, but
that's what I was going to ask, because I'm in London. I know we have a bunch of people on in different places. Like, do you think there's ways that either that the international community can sort of get things started elsewhere and hopefully influence the US, or, you know, ways for, I know the US tends to be like a leader in a lot of these things or something that people look to, but yeah, would it be meaningful to see that like coming from Europe? And do you think that could influence US ambitions if they saw that coming from abroad?
It'll provide some norms and things to strive for, like in some of the new carbon management strategies or some of the national planning that they're doing. I do think people in Europe still have challenges around, you know, the Dutch farmers or whoever in lots of countries. There's challenges too, but maybe they have different social dynamics that are probably less bifurcated, so maybe they can show us some social examples of how to solve those as well.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks so much for joining us. As always, it's a pleasure to have you on This Is CDR. And Toby, whenever you're ready, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mega, and thank you to the audience for these great questions. Holly, you know you're very busy, but thank you for being with us for an hour, and it was a great discussion, and have a good rest of your summer. I'm going to share my screen really briefly here to go through a few things. All right, so we didn't mention earlier, but we do have a live bill in Massachusetts. If you are in Massachusetts, it would be great to have you help us by contacting your local reps. Chris, if you could put the call tool for Massachusetts into the chat, and also the California one, that would be awesome. We have another bill in California. So these are two pending actions that I think could be really impactful, and they're both at points in the legislative process where getting more legislator support is super impactful. So please help with that. Many of you may have seen that we've launched a German language This Is CDR. The next episode is Tuesday, right before the English language This Is CDR with Carbon Future CEO Hans Junginger. So please join us for that. If you speak German, it is in German. And then on This Is CDR, we have a great run coming up in August. Next week, we have an innovative company based in Minnesota called Carba that does biomass torrefaction and burial. So we're going to learn about that next week, and a bunch of other great episodes. There will be a link in the chat to sign up for all of these, and we'd love to see you there. So again, next week, Carba. Thank you again to Dr. Buck for being with us, and thank you all for joining us. Have a great week, and we'll see you again soon.